You know that VisualPolitik is one of the few political channels that pays a lot of attention to Latin America, one of the least covered regions in the world. Perhaps that is why many of you have often asked us to talk more about Latin America, despite the way I butcher Spanish names. Well, we have a solution. We're proud to present LATAMpolitik, a newsletter that we have prepared together with geopolitical consulting firm Perch Perspectives. If you subscribe, every month you will receive 12 newsletters with the best information and analysis on Latin America to keep you up to date and better understand everything that is happening in the region. The cost? You can subscribe for less than 35 cents per newsletter, less than a small taco or donut a week. In return, you'll be kept up to date on all the major happenings in the region and better understand all the possible implications. In addition, all of you who support us at Patreon level 4 and 5 will receive LATAMpolitik at zero cost. You can find all the info at latampolitik.com. Sometimes it happens that the most unsuspected people end up making a splash and become the surprise protagonists on the world's stage. You see, my friends, this may be what best summarizes Lenín Moreno's path to the presidency of Ecuador. We are talking about a man who for more than 6 years was vice president to Rafael Correa himself, one of the great leaders of the so-called 21st century socialism. We are talking about a politician who came to the Carondelet Palace, Ecuador's equivalent of the White House, amidst accusations of fraud to keep Correa's movement, Correaism, standing against all odds, but who shortly hereafter completely disavowed the legacy of his predecessor. A legacy that, as it turns out, made Moreno's presidency quite a bumpy ride. You see, by the end of Correa's presidency, Ecuador was in a very delicate situation. Once the more than $80 billion of income generated by the oil price boom had been consumed, the Ecuadorian economy entered into a huge spiral of crisis, budgetary imbalances, and public debt.
We owe almost $75 billion. We have to pay 10% plus capital of that amount, almost $11 billion annually in debt service. Lenín Moreno.
Of course, macroeconomic imbalances were not the only thing Lenín Moreno encountered when he became president. But now his time has passed. 4 years after coming to power, Ecuador is sliding into a new era under a new presidency. And the question we are pondering is, what is Ecuador's future? What kind of Ecuador will Lenín Moreno leave to his successor? Would you like to know how this president has spent his time in the Carondelet Palace? I bet you do, so let's get cracking.
The Rapture.
Moreno's presidency began with a very clear idea in mind. Ecuador was in very bad shape economically, and a lot of money was needed. And to achieve this, there was really no other way than for the country to disassociate itself from the growing bloc of Latin American 21st century socialism, and thus demonstrate that the new Ecuadorian government was nothing like Correa's, nor like that of Venezuela, Bolivia, or Kirchner's Argentina.
I am not interested in power. I am interested in the welfare of all. I am interested in the present and future of Ecuador. I am interested in the country in which our children and grandchildren will live, the future of our elders. Lenín Moreno, President of Ecuador.
However, after more than 10 years of Rafael Correa's government, this was not going to be an easy task. For example, among the main stumbling blocks was the enormous distrust of international investors towards a country that, in 2008, had announced a debt default. A default that was not caused by any particular economic or financial problem at the time, but was purely and simply due to a political and ideological issue. Overnight, international investors were confronted with news like this.
December 12th, 2008. Ecuador says it will default on its foreign debt. Wall Street Journal.
And obviously, if you do not pay your debts, you cannot expect to borrow again. And if you do, it's more than likely that you'll have to pay very high interest rates. And that is exactly what happened. So that when the price of oil began to collapse in 2014, the Ecuadorian economy gradually followed suit. Thus, Lenín Moreno found himself at the helm of an Ecuador riddled with problems, and where public revenues were simply not enough to pay the bills. So at that point, the decision taken by the new president was to wipe the slate clean, so to speak, so that shortly after coming to power, he began to break off all relations with his predecessor, a break with his mentor that he wanted to stage in style. Among Lenín Moreno's first decision was to remove Ecuador from UNASUR, the economic bloc of countries formed at the São Paulo Forum. Then, to remove Ecuador from ALBA, the Bolivian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, created by Hugo Chavez himself. To recognize Juan Guaido as the illegitimate president of Venezuela. To end Julian Assange's asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and re-establish a good bilateral relationship with the United States. A process that, by the way, culminated in an unexpected meeting between the Ecuadorian president and Donald Trump in February 2020. Moreno also dismissed his vice president, Jorge Glass, just 2 months after taking office. Glass had also been vice president under Rafael Correa and was accused of receiving $13.5 million in bribes from the infamous Brazilian construction company Odebrecht. In other words, as you can see, Lenín Moreno practically made a total break with the legacy of Correa. And while it is true that none of those initial actions consisted of actual economic reforms, they did send the message that he was not Correa. Something that, for example, may have helped the country to regain access to multi-million-dollar loans on reasonable terms from international organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank.
February 21st, 2019. Ecuador announces international loans for $10 billion. Finanzas.com.
Of course, as you can imagine, the money had a specific purpose, to support what is known as the Ecuadorian government's Prosperity Plan. A reform plan that meant dismantling piece by piece a good part of Correa's legacy, including many of the existing subsidies, which, as we will see, would mark the second half of his presidency. But having said that, and now we know how and why he broke with his predecessor, the big question for us, the question I'm sure many of you are asking yourselves at this very moment is Ecuador a better country today than it was 4 years ago? And to answer that, let's take a look.
One government, two stages.
The presidency of Lenín Moreno in Ecuador can be divided into two well-defined periods. The first between 2017 to 2019, and the second period between 2019 and 2021. The first of these two phases was characterized, as we've already told you, by an abrupt and total break with Correaism, and by the attempt to carry out economic reforms aimed at regaining the confidence of the markets. In fact, shortly after coming to power in September 2017, Moreno announced his first major plan for the country, his economic program for the next 4 years. This program included, among other things, an increase in income tax for corporations from 22 to 25%, with some exceptions for small companies, the elimination of the capital gains law in an attempt to boost construction, and the increase of tariffs on 375 goods as a protectionist measure. As far as austerity goes, the goal of reducing the deficit to 1% by 2020 was set, with measures such as a 10% reduction in the salaries of high-ranking civil servants and a freeze on hiring in the public sector, among others. In other words, we are talking about a plan that could well fit into a framework of moderate centre-left policies, with the understanding that unlimited debt is never a good idea. This first period was also marked by the fight against corruption. Let's not fool ourselves. In addition to being relatively popular, it is also important when it comes to doing business. The cleaner a country is, and the more it appears to be so, the better. Nobody wants to leave their money in the hands of crooks. Well, the fact is that in order to carry out this battle, Moreno made use of two major tools. On the one hand, the constitutional referendum and the popular consultation held in February 2018, and an anti-corruption law approved in December 2020. With the first, Moreno pushed for a change so that the country's very constitution would prohibit people convicted of corruption offences from running for office. In addition, this consultation also approved things such as the limit of one re-election for all elected authorities and the repeal of the capital gains law itself. Secondly, the 2020 anti-corruption law seeks to impose new controls on public contracting and private sector corruption, a law which, although Moreno denies it, most likely was one of the IMF demands in exchange for lending Ecuador another $2 billion. And well, at the end of the day, what can I say? If you want my money, I'd say that the first thing I'd have to do is make sure that I put it in good hands. Don't you think? It really makes sense. However, whether or not all these measures will translate into real results is something that only time will tell. To begin with, the constitutional change prevented Rafael Correa, convicted of corruption, from trying to return to power, at least not directly. But this is not the end of the story. During Moreno's presidency, steps have also been taken in other areas, such as freedom of the press. Moreno promised during his election campaign to modify the 2013 Organic Law of Communication, a law passed by ex-President Correa that determined that communication was a public service and gave the government the authority to regulate the content of the media and to investigate and sanction journalists. And Lenin fulfilled this promise. The National Assembly approved a modification in 2018 that came into force the following year, and that, among other things, eliminated the department known as Supercom, the Superintendence of Information and Communication, the media sanctioning body that Rafael Correa's government liked so much. Well, this first period in which, as you can see, it seems fair to say there were many advances, came to an end in 2019. And the question is, what happened at that time for us to talk about a change of period? Well, buckle up, because here, right here, is where the curveballs start rolling in. Check this out.
The decree, the turning point.
So as you have seen, Lenín Moreno's presidency started with everyone thinking that we would see a reboot of Correa's policies, and instead it ended up being a kind of unexpected transition. You know, a betrayal for some and an insufficient change for others. As a result, credibility in President Moreno's word fell from 67% in August 2017 to a low of 10.4% in October 2019, when Moreno also announced the famous Decree 883. This decree that eliminated fuel subsidies marked the beginning of his plummeting popularity. The Ecuadorian president presented this measure as one of the tools needed to reduce the deficit and thus be able to control the increase in public debt. But the issue of fuel subsidies in Ecuador is not a trivial matter. Ecuador has been subsidizing fuels since long before Rafael Correa. In fact, for more than 40 years, since way back in 1974. However, 11 days after the start of the violent protest that arose over the attempt to eliminate the fuel subsidy, Moreno decided to backtrack and repeal the controversial Decree 883. Of course, getting rid of subsidies that have been in place for decades, no matter how inefficient and inadequate they may be, is an almost impossible task, especially if you want to do it without angering a large part of the population. To give you an idea, eliminating these subsidies caused diesel prices to double and regular gasoline prices to increase by more than 25%. So you can only imagine the enormous anger of many Ecuadorians. However, hold on a moment, because in spite of this, Ecuador still had the cheapest gasoline in all of Latin America. And, let's not fool ourselves, maintaining this subsidy came at a very high price. Fuel subsidies in Ecuador accounts for some $3.5 billion in spending each year, which is just over 3% of GDP and more than 20% of all oil export revenues. And to top it off, this type of formula encourages a much higher consumption of oil, which also increases the cost of these public policies. In other words, eliminating these subsidies was one of the star measures to balance the public accounts. So, as you can imagine, the repeal of Decree 883 completely destroyed the deficit reduction forecasts the government had been working with. And to add insult to injury, the damage had already been done. Despite not achieving his goal, the political cost was inevitable. For some, for approving it, and for others, for repealing it. The fact is that Moreno's popularity plummeted from 77% at the beginning of his presidency to less than 10%. And no, since then, he's not made up any ground. Moreno had his #BringBackSimon moment. However, in spite of everything, the government continued to move forward along the same lines.
September 24th, 2020, the government allows fuel imports for the private sector. Ecuador loses its monopoly on the purchase and sale of derivatives for the industrial sector, el comercio. The emergence of the coronavirus favors the deregulation of the price of gasoline in Ecuador. The government will apply from July a system of price bands with a ceiling and floor. If the fuel fluctuates below, the gas stations will charge that minimum to the consumer, and the excess amount will go to the public coffers. If the international price rises beyond 5% from one month to another, then state subsidies will be activated so that citizens do not feel the increase in price. El país.
And yes, it can't be said that this is strictly a price deregulation, since the government still imposes a maximum price, a minimum price, and still contemplates subsidies. Nevertheless, it represents an amount of savings for the public coffers that some sources have put at around $1 billion a year. As you can see, Moreno inherited a difficult economic situation. Once the oil bonanza was over, he had to play the worst cards. And to make matters worse, the coronavirus arrived.
Ecuador enfrenta el momento más crítico de su historia. Al impacto de los efectos de la pandemia se suma una economía debilitada por el endeudamiento irresponsable y la corrupción galopante del gobierno anterior.
If economic growth in 2019, before the coronavirus, was already at a dismal 0.1%, the Ecuadorian GDP contracted by 9% in 2020, and forecasts indicate that it will not return to solid growth levels until at least 2024. The first consequence of this has been an increase in poverty levels to over 30% of the population. In addition, the drastic drop in oil revenues, Ecuador's main source of foreign exchange, has meant that despite all the reforms, the government has been forced to continue feeding the enormous debt already dragging down the Ecuadorian economy. So you see, my friends, in spite of the turnaround that Lenín Moreno tried to make, the truth is that luck has not been on his side. And now, for the coming years, the next government faces a very polarized society, a country increasingly dependent on international creditors, and a huge lack of economic visibility. Where is Ecuador headed? In short, only time will tell. And now, it's over to you. How do you evaluate the reformist attempts of Moreno's term in office? Do you think they were enough, or that, on the contrary, they fell short? How do you think he should have dealt with the protests of late 2019? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to VisualPolitik. Best regards, and see you next time.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.